Hello, this is a short information video about our double Vibedrum, but also about steel tongue drums in general, and a little bit about handpans and some things you might want to consider before you purchase one of these types of drums. It's really easy to play. Anybody can play it. You don't need to be a musician because all the notes are already tuned, so you just can't hit a wrong note. They all sound really, really good. Now this is technically a steel tongue drum, which means that the notes are formed by cutting into the steel, whereas a handpan drum, the notes are pressed into the steel and then hit with a hammer to make it. And this is the main way you can tell the difference between a steel tongue drum and a handpan. And a steel tongue drum is in the handpan family. Let's talk about handpans and steel tongue drums and the construction, the steel itself that's being used to manufacture these drums. So first of all, let's talk about handpans. Handpan drums tend to be quite large and high as well, and they're louder. They sound louder and they have a really beautiful sound, but there are a couple of disadvantages. They're a little bit harder to carry around because they're so much bigger, but also when they make the handpan drum, they put either on the bottom, almost always on the bottom of it, you'll see a large hole in this, and this is known as the goo hole. The hole's shaped a little bit like the intake of a jet engine, where it's kind of curved in to help create and project the sound out to where it's a lot louder. Now, in order to form this goo hole, you've got to use fairly thin steel. You can't use thick steel to form this type of hole. So handpans tend to be made out of very thin steel, usually like an 18 gauge, sometimes a 16, sometimes 20, but generally speaking, the metal on a handpan drum is 1 millimeter to 1.25 millimeters thick, or about 0.04 inches. So it's fairly thin, which means that if you press on it too hard, or if you drop it or step on it or something like this, it will dent very easily, which will knock the drum out of tune. It'll have to be sent back to be retuned and the dents to be knocked out of it, which is a little bit of a complicated process. There are some other drums called a hybrid drum, and they're a mix between a handpan and a steel tongue. And what they've done is they've formed the goo hole either on the top of the drum or on the bottom, but the notes are formed not by denting but by cutting like we do with a true steel tongue drum. And these are known as hybrid drums, but also again, because of the goo hole, they're made of very, very thin steel. And so because the notes are cut, you've weakened the entire structure of the drum, and if you hit it really, really hard with a mallet, you might start bending that tab in a little bit because the thickness of the steel is very, very thin, so it's easier to bend. So these are some things to consider when you think about it. Now for us, I've chosen to form my own shells and to make my own shells and my own hemispheres. And the reason I did this was it gives me the latitude to be able to choose the type and grade of steel I want to use, as well as the thickness I want to use. So on our drums from Vibedrum, we use a 13 gauge steel, which is thicker than anybody else is using. And the reason I do this, and 13 gauge steel is like 0.094 inches thick, where almost everybody, or everybody else that's making these types of drums, is using a 14 gauge, which is 0.07 inches thick. The reason I chose the thicker steel was, one, it makes the drum very, very, very durable, but also it increases the note resonance, and the notes ring for a long time, and it vibrates for a long time, and this is due to the thickness of the steel. Most other people, or a lot of other people, are using propane tanks, sometimes usually old recycled or repurposed propane tanks. I chose not to do this for a couple of reasons. One is propane tanks are made with 14 gauge steel, which is thinner. That's one reason. The second reason is the reason why the propane tanks are no longer propane tanks is because they've been in service for a long time and they failed what is called a hydrostat test, which tests the ability of the steel to flex. And they failed this because the steel has become brittle over time. And if you look at it through a microscope, you'll see hairline stress cracks all through the steel. In addition, the steel has become quite brittle, so it makes it to where it doesn't flex at all. Also, old propane tanks have been in service for a long time, and a lot of them have pitting in the steel. And so a lot of people will kind of grind this pitting out, but now you've got uneven steel. You've got it's thicker on one spot and thinner in another, and the same thing on the notes, which kind of, you know, creates a lot of problems when trying to tune the drum, but also in just the whole structure of the drum and the general sound, because you've got varying thicknesses of steel as you go. So this is why we use new steel, and our steel meets AISI standards, and that means American Iron and Steel Institute. So it's a very, very high quality steel. In addition, I started thinking about steel in general, and I thought, well, great, we paint on the outside, but how are we going to protect the inside of the drum from the elements, from rusting, corrosion, these kinds of things? So after the drum is formed, we take the drum and completely submerge it in a zinc bath, and we plate both the inside of the drum as well as the outside of the drum with zinc plating. So it's 100% protected on the inside as well as the outside from rusting, either now or in the future. This is our stainless steel, and this has been electro-polished, which is pretty cool. Makes it very, very shiny. It's almost like chrome, but it's not chrome. And again, when I formed these shells, I wanted to use, you know, one of the best stainless steels that I could use. So I'm using a medical grade stainless steel that's also 13 gauge. So it's also 0.094 inches thick. So it's thicker than anybody else out there. I've seen some other stainless steel drums and they're using like 18 gauge, like 0.04 inches thick. So it's a very good, solid drum. And again, the notes resonate for a long, long time. Yeah, it's still going. Yeah. So this is our stainless steel drum. It's beautiful. I love it. And with the double vibe drum, the cool thing is we do one scale on one side, usually like a lower scale, and then we do a higher scale on the other side. So it's kind of like having two drums in one. Some things to look for when you're looking at these types of drums. What type of steel is being used, and how thick is it? And if it's got a goo hole in it, either in the bottom or the top, then you know that it's made of very, very thin steel. And it's fine and it's good. You just have to treat it a little bit more gently because it's not so durable. So now that we've talked a little bit about the steel, let's talk about the notes and what makes a good note and what makes a good drum. So we use a hexagonal form on our notes, which is much more complicated to cut than you've seen the other ones, or they're just like this, or they've got a line that goes this way and another goes that way. And this is a much more complicated form. And I formed it this way mostly just because it looks cooler, but also because of the smaller end down here, the notes sound a little bit better. When we look at the notes, there's lots of things you can do. You have to think about, well, the shape of the note, of course, is somewhat important. But more important than the shape of the note is actually the placement of the note. And so as you can see, we've got our four big notes, or our lower notes, yeah, on this side even bigger, as far away from each other as I can, so that if I hit this really, really low one here, it doesn't activate all these notes around it. So yes, I could have put notes in here and here and here, and I could have just filled this drum with notes. But there's a couple things you have to think about. If I fill it full of notes, first I'm weakening the entire structure of the drum. But also, if I have notes that are too close together, when I hit one note, it activates the note next to it, or the one over here. And I've heard other people use a fancy marketing word, and they call this overtones, and what they're really talking about is distortion between one note and another. I want the note to be pure, so when you hit a D, it's a D, not a D in the third octave plus a D in the fourth octave. It's a D. in the third, right? So the note spacing, the distance between the metal of the notes, is very important. The less spacing you have, the closer the notes are together, the more harmonic distortion you're going to have. In addition, if you load up one side with all the big notes and the other side with the small notes, you're going to have the same problem. I hit a big note and it's going to activate the big notes next to it, because the big notes tend to vibrate more than the smaller notes. And so the note spacing is very, very important. The distance here, the distance sits in the drums, and their spacing between each other is very, very important to make a good sounding drum. Now that we've, formed the shells using the steel I want to use, and we've zinc plated, cut the notes and zinc plated it, put it together, all really nice and smooth. I don't need any rope around the edges to hide the edges, because the edges are beautiful. It's been zinc plated, it's all ready to go. So now let's talk about the coating. We need to coat it with something. When I make these drums, I want to do it with as little environmental impact as possible. So we could spray paint the drums with like an automotive spray paint, or buy a can of spray paint at the hardware store or the automotive store or something. But spray paints contain something called VOCs, volatile organic compounds, and these contribute to greenhouse gases. So I didn't want to use a spray paint. As versatile as they are, you got a million different colors to choose from with spray paints. A second thing that you can do, and I've seen some people do, is I can put a pattern in the drum, and to put this pattern in, you can either etch it or engrave it into the steel. I chose not to do any etching or engraving for two reasons. One is, when you etch the steel or engrave it, you make it even thinner than it was before in those spots where you etch in the lines. And I don't want that. I want the steel to be a uniform thickness the whole way through. The other thing is when you etch steel or engrave steel, most of the time you need to use some type of an acid, either like hydrochloric acid, sulfuric, or even sometimes even more aggressive acids such as nitric acid. And these are very, very hazardous chemicals. And then after you're done doing all of this, now you've got acid that's got dissolved metals in it that you've got to deal with it. Now, in some countries, they don't have much in the way of environmental regulations for small businesses, and so they just dump the stuff down the drain. But again, keeping the environment in mind, I didn't want to deal with these hazardous chemicals or generating hazardous waste and then disposing of it properly, because these drums are made in the USA, which does have EPA standards and regulations, even for small businesses. So, after a lot of research, I found powder coating. And powder coating, it uses a powder paint, not a spray paint, and it's put on and baked. And most powder coat paints and most powder coated items, such as bicycles and things like this, they just put on one coat of powder and then it's done. So it's very thin, and it scratches pretty easily as well. But I wanted to make our drums not only look good, but I wanted to make them as scratch resistant as possible. So after a lot of research, I found this unique powder, and what we do is we put on one coat of powder, and then we put on a second coat. And the second coat of powder reacts with the first one chemically, and they bond together. So we've got a really good, thick, like 2-coat powder. It's very, very scratch resistant. It's not completely scratch proof. You can scratch it if you try hard enough. But it's scratch resistant. It's a good hard paint, which means it keeps the sound good. It's not a soft paint. And so our drums are double powder coated for a good look and long-lasting good look, and somewhat scratch resistant, and it's done in an environmentally low impact or friendly way. Okay, to sum up, our double vibe drums have a scale on one side and a completely different scale on the other side. We can do many, many, many different types of scales, and we can do it in different hertz. We can do one side in 440 and the other side in 432. It's up to you what you want. The Vibedrum is made from 13 gauge high quality steel or 13 gauge medical grade stainless steel. This makes the drum very, very durable, and the note resonance is the longest you've ever seen on any of these types of drums. A good 8 to 10 seconds, sometimes more, on most of the notes. The notes are spaced properly so you do not get harmonic distortion or overtones between the notes. So when you hit one note, it doesn't activate the note next to it. So the notes are pure. The drum is double powder coated with a special exotic powder coat that I found that creates a good, hard, thick coating. It's an environmentally friendly type of coating. It doesn't have any VOCs like spray paints, and we do not etch the drum using hazardous chemicals such as acids and generating hazardous waste. So it's made with a low environmental impact. Anybody can play this drum. You can play with mallets. Yeah. And even these mallets have a different end if you want a different sound. One's a little harder sound, the other's a little bit of softer sound. You can play with either end. You can play with your fingers. The note spacing is done in such a way that I could do like 4 notes just like this. I tend to play faster with fingers because I got more of them. So very, very little hand movement. So I feel strongly that I produce one of the very, very best steel tongue drums on the market. It's durable. The thicker metal means that the drum will last for a long, long time. It will stay in tune for a long time. So it's not that it will sound good and look good when you get it or 6 months later, but it will sound good and look good for years to come, and it will stay in tune for years to come. So that's our double vibe drum. Thank you.